The fateful morning of December 7, 1941, dawned like any other tranquil Sunday across the Hawaiian Islands, particularly at Wheeler Field. As the sun began its ascent, most of the dedicated airmen were still immersed in slumber or savoring a leisurely morning meal when, at precisely 7:48 a.m., an urgent radio transmission pierced the serene atmosphere. Air raid, Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill. Among those roused by the sudden alarm was Second Lieutenant George Welch, who had spent the previous night engaged in a poker game and had managed to secure only a meager 3 hours of rest before the concussive force of explosions jolted him awake. His mind, at that critical juncture, was not preoccupied with thoughts of valor or the annals of history. Rather, his singular focus was on the immediate imperative of launching into the sky before the encroaching Japanese forces could annihilate every single aircraft still grounded. Wheeler Field was instantly plunged into a maelstrom of disarray. Ground crew mechanics sprinted frantically between the cavernous hangars, while officers, their voices strained with urgency, bellowed contradictory directives across the tarmac. The ominous, distant rumble of bombs detonating upon Pearl Harbor's battleship row intensified with each passing second, a stark soundtrack to the unfolding catastrophe. Unwilling to wait for the cumbersome process of official authorization, Welch and his steadfast wingman, Kenneth Taylor, impulsively commandeered a vehicle. They sped with determined haste for 10 miles to Haleiwa Field, a remote dispersal site where a number of P-40 Warhawks had been strategically positioned for routine training maneuvers. Upon arrival, they swiftly enlisted the aid of mechanics to arm and fuel 2 of these formidable fighters. There was no time for elaborate flight plans or comprehensive tactical briefings. Their actions were dictated solely by raw, unadulterated instinct and a surge of adrenaline. By 8:15 a.m., the distinctive roar of Welch's P-40B echoed as it hurtled down the rudimentary dirt runway, ascending into the smoke-filled Hawaiian sky. The meticulously orchestrated Japanese assault had been executed with an almost surgical precision. The initial wave alone comprised a staggering 183 aircraft, spearheaded by the potent Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers and the agile Aichi D-3A dive bombers. Intelligence assessments prior to the offensive had confidently predicted that the American forces would be utterly incapable of scrambling any aircraft into the air. This projection very nearly proved accurate. Indeed, out of an impressive complement of nearly 400 aircraft stationed across the island of Oahu, only a mere handful managed to achieve liftoff that morning. Lieutenant Welch was among that exclusive, defiant few. As his P-40 ascended through an altitude of 2,000 feet, his gaze pierced the hazy sky, and he immediately discerned them. Not merely 1 or 2 isolated enemy aircraft, but an entire, formidable formation, 15 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, now returning from their devastating bombing runs over Pearl Harbor, maintaining tight V formations at an approximate altitude of 3,500 feet. They were making their way back towards their formidable aircraft carriers, very likely the Akagi or Kaga, imbued with the conviction that their mission had been successfully accomplished. Please stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. According to established fighter doctrine, Welch would have been expected to climb to an altitude of 5,000 or even 6,000 feet, thereby positioning himself with a significant altitude advantage, allowing him to descend with superior speed. The P-40's powerful Allison engine was renowned for its exceptional dive performance, and energy tactics formed the very bedrock of every pilot's training in flight school. However, Welch's eyes flickered to his fuel gauge. He had departed with perhaps only 45 minutes of precious combat fuel, and a protracted climb would inevitably consume invaluable minutes. He scrutinized the bombers once more. They were already initiating a gradual descent towards the expansive ocean, consolidating their formation for the arduous journey back to their carriers. It was then that he made a decision that would undoubtedly strike any flight instructor at Randolph Field as utterly preposterous. He decisively pushed the control stick forward and plunged his aircraft towards the undulating wave tops. Welch had, at most, a mere 15 seconds to fully comprehend the daunting challenge confronting him. 15 Japanese dive bombers, each manned by a 3-person crew and still equipped with formidable defensive machine guns. While the Aichi D-3A might have already released its 550-pound bomb over Pearl Harbor, it was far from defenseless. Each VAL was armed with 2 forward-firing 7.7 mm Type 97 machine guns and a rear-facing 7.7 mm flexible mount, expertly operated by the radio operator. In a conventional engagement scenario, this meant Welch would be facing a barrage from at least 15 rear gunners the very instant he maneuvered into position for an attack run. The mathematical odds were brutally stacked against him. His P-40B carried 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, each loaded with approximately 200 rounds. This amounted to a seemingly impressive total of about 1,200 rounds, a figure that diminishes rapidly when one considers the firing time. At the M2 Browning's cyclic rate of roughly 750 to 850 rounds per minute, Welch possessed, at most, a mere 90 seconds of continuous trigger time before his guns would fall silent. 90 seconds to endeavor to bring down 15 enemy aircraft, while simultaneously enduring their retaliatory fire. The paramount principle of aerial combat was, without question, altitude advantage. Every pilot assimilated this fundamental truth from their very first day of tactical training. This concept's origin stretched back to the tumultuous era of World War I, when pioneering aviators such as Oswald Bolt meticulously codified energy fighting into formal doctrine. Height, in this context, unequivocally equated to speed, which in turn equated to a multitude of tactical options. The prescribed maneuver was to dive upon the adversary from above, leveraging the force of gravity to accumulate velocity, execute the attack pass, and then swiftly climb back to a superior altitude before the enemy could effectively react. The P-40, with its robust design, was inherently suited for this precise style of engagement. Its diving speed was truly exceptional, and in a vertical combat scenario, it possessed the raw power to outmaneuver the majority of Japanese aircraft. However, ascending to a tactical altitude of 6,000 feet would necessitate 3 to 4 minutes, with the Allison B-1710 engine operating at its maximum power output. By that crucial point, the Japanese formation would have advanced 5 miles closer to the sanctuary of their carriers, and would potentially be under the protective umbrella of the Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters that had escorted them to Pearl Harbor. Welch had distinctly observed at least 3 Zeros strafing ground targets during his frantic takeoff. These highly skilled enemy pilots would undoubtedly respond with immediate aggression the moment they detected an American fighter climbing into an attack position. He would find himself outnumbered by a staggering margin of 20-1 before he even had the opportunity to unleash his initial burst of fire. Furthermore, the Japanese forces were not anticipating any significant resistance at this particular juncture. Their intelligence briefings had unequivocally assured them that American fighters would be utterly annihilated on the ground, and even if a few managed to become airborne, they would be disorganized and easily dispatched by the combat air patrol. Consequently, the VAL crews were likely in a state of relative relaxation, perhaps consulting their navigational maps, meticulously calculating fuel consumption for the lengthy return journey. They maintained textbook three-plane V formations at an altitude of 3,200 feet, rigorously adhering to radio silence, and were, in all probability, already envisioning the hot meal awaiting them aboard their carrier. Welch's audacious decision to descend to an ultra-low altitude was not merely unconventional. It flagrantly contravened every tenet he had been taught. Yet, desperation possesses a remarkable capacity for clarifying options. He possessed no means to outline them. He could not afford to await reinforcements that simply did not exist. What he could, however, do was embrace unpredictability. The Japanese rear gunners had been rigorously trained to vigilantly scan the sky above and behind their aircraft, not the expansive ocean surface below. If Welch could maintain an altitude below 50 feet, ingeniously utilizing the Pacific swells as natural terrain cover, he might just manage to approach close enough to make those 6.50 caliber machine guns inflict their devastating toll before the enemy even registered his presence. The P-40 Warhawk, it must be noted, was not originally designed for such daring wave-hopping maneuvers. Its liquid-cooled Allison engine featured a massive radiator scoop prominently positioned beneath the fuselage, and a single miscalculation at 50 feet, a fleeting moment of inattention, or an unexpected rogue ocean swell would inevitably send Welch's aircraft cartwheeling catastrophically into the unforgiving Pacific. However, this audacious tactic offered one monumental advantage: virtual invisibility. At such an ultra-low altitude, the P-40's camouflage paint scheme seamlessly blended with the dark, reflective ocean surface, and the Japanese rear gunners, whose training dictated scanning for threats at their own altitude or above, simply were not looking downwards. Welch subtly throttled back to avoid overshooting his targets, and maintained an unwavering gaze, locked onto the lead V formation. Ocean spray began to lash against his windscreen. The altimeter's needle danced erratically between 40 and 60 feet. Every primal instinct screamed at him to climb, to escape the perilous proximity of the water, yet he held the control stick with unwavering resolve. The physiological stress was immense. Flying at such an incredibly low altitude demanded absolute, unyielding concentration. A comprehensive study conducted subsequent to the war by the Naval Air Development Center revealed that pilots who engaged in extended periods of flight below 100 feet experienced heart rates exceeding 160 beats per minute and exhibited significantly diminished reaction times due to the phenomenon of tunnel vision. Welch was operating precisely within this high-stress zone, his peripheral vision constricting, his entire focus now solely fixed upon the bombers, which were a mere 800 yards ahead. The lead bomber in the formation was flying marginally lower than the others, gradually descending towards the water, as the entire formation prepared for the protracted cruise back to their carriers. Welch skillfully pulled up to 70 feet, angled slightly to the right to circumvent the direct line of fire from the rear gunner, and patiently waited until he was a mere 400 yards away. At that precise distance, the convergence pattern of his 6.50 caliber guns created an intensely concentrated cone of fire, approximately 6 feet in diameter. The M2 Browning fired a 710-grain bullet at an astonishing velocity of 2,900 feet per second. This kinetic energy was more than sufficient to punch through the Val's aluminum airframe and inflict catastrophic damage upon its critical systems. He squeezed the trigger. The P-40 shuddered violently, as all 6 guns erupted simultaneously. Tracers arced across the intervening gap in less than a second. The rear gunner on the lead valve was still diligently scanning the sky above when the initial rounds mercilessly tore through the fuselage. The bomber's right wing root exploded in a violent spray of fuel, and shredded metal. The aircraft violently rolled inverted and slammed into the ocean at a terrifying speed of 180 miles per hour. There was no time for parachutes, no opportunity to react, just a stark white splash and a scattering of debris. The pilot of the second bomber, in the V formation, registered the arcing tracers far too late. He attempted to bank sharply to the left, but Welch had already adjusted his aim with lightning speed. Another 2-second burst. This time, the deadly rounds methodically walked up the fuselage from the tail section directly to the cockpit. The valve's canopy shattered into a myriad of fragments, and the aircraft pitched violently nose down into a steep, uncontrollable dive, leaving a thick plume of black smoke in its wake. It impacted the water a mere 3 seconds later, 2 enemy aircraft dispatched in less than 20 seconds. At this point, the Japanese formation erupted into utter pandemonium. Radio discipline completely disintegrated as pilots began frantically shouting warnings to one another. The third bomber in the lead V formation executed a hard brake to the right, its rear gunner finally spotting the P-40 skimming precariously above the waves. Welch clearly observed the muzzle flashes as the 7.7 mm Type 97 machine gun opened fire, but the gunner's aim was directed at where Welch had been moments before, not at his current trajectory. The rounds passed harmlessly overhead. Welch swiftly rolled left, maintaining his way top level, and skillfully maneuvered up underneath the turning bomber's belly, exploiting a crucial blind spot where the rear gunner could not depress his weapon low enough to track the aggressive P-40. Another devastating burst. The valve's engine cowling disintegrated, and a torrent of coolant sprayed across Welch's windscreen. The enemy pilot was desperately struggling to maintain control, but the Aichi's single 1,000 horsepower Kinsei engine was rapidly failing. The bomber slowed perceptibly, staggered awkwardly, and then pancaked violently into the ocean, skipping twice across the surface before breaking apart into shattered fragments. 3 confirmed kills in a blistering 90 seconds. The air battle unfolded with startling rapidity, as an American fighter pilot achieved 3 aerial victories within a mere 90-second span. With only a dozen enemy bombers remaining, every single Japanese airman was now acutely aware that a formidable American adversary was relentlessly pursuing them from an unexpected direction below. Consequently, the meticulous Japanese formation disintegrated, scattering across the sky. Conventional military doctrine typically dictated that bombers under the duress of a fighter assault should tighten their ranks, consolidate their defensive firepower, and rigorously preserve their formation's integrity. However, this engagement was anything but conventional. The American pilot, Welch, was not descending from the familiar vantage point above, where his presence could be easily observed and defensive fire coordinated. Instead, he was materializing from the expansive ocean surface with the predatory swiftness of a shark, delivering devastating blows before vanishing back into the undulating wave tops, leaving the enemy gunners scrambling to acquire a target. The psychological repercussions of this unprecedented tactic were utterly demoralizing for the Japanese crews. The fourth bomber, in a desperate bid for self-preservation, attempted to ascend to a higher altitude and perceive safety. This maneuver proved to be a fatal miscalculation. As the aircraft strained to climb away from the ocean's embrace, its airspeed decelerated significantly, dropping from approximately 200 knots to perhaps 160. This presented its entire vulnerable underside to Welch's menacing guns. With precision, he ascended to an altitude of 150 feet, perfectly aligning with the bomber's climb angle, and unleashed a 3-second fusillade into the wing root, precisely where the critical fuel tanks were housed. The Japanese valve's wing crumpled upward at a 90-degree angle, an unnatural contortion. The stricken aircraft then executed 2 rapid snap rolls before plummeting directly toward the unforgiving ocean surface. Tragically, its crew had no opportunity to escape the doomed machine. By this juncture, Welch's ammunition counter indicated that he had expended roughly 400 rounds, equating to a substantial third of his total ordnance capacity. Concurrently, his fuel gauge was registering a more rapid decline than anticipated. The powerful Allison engine, operating at full combat power, was voraciously consuming fuel, and the constant, energy-intensive maneuvering at such low altitudes was significantly impacting his operational range. He estimated he had perhaps 20 minutes of flight time remaining before he would be compelled to disengage and return to base, or face the dire prospect of an emergency ditching in the vast ocean. Yet, the surging adrenaline of combat profoundly suppressed any rational considerations regarding prudent fuel management, pushing him onward. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. 2 bombers positioned within the second V formation attempted a synchronized turn, intending to bring both of their rear gunners to bear upon the American fighter simultaneously. This was, by all accounts, an intelligent tactical decision to establish a crossfire pattern that would compel the aggressive American fighter to either disengage or brave a formidable barrage of bullets. However, Welch, demonstrating remarkable foresight, had already anticipated their maneuver. Rather than pursuing them into their turn, he executed a sharp reversal to the hard left, descended once more to a mere 50 feet above the water, and effectively disappeared from their visual acquisition. The Japanese rear gunners, bewildered, discharged their weapons into empty air, while Welch skillfully repositioned himself 800 yards distant, rendered virtually invisible against the dark, undulating water. He then re-engaged, approaching from a 45-degree angle, singling out the bomber positioned on the outside of the turn. The pilot of this particular aircraft displayed considerable skill. The instant he detected the telltale tracers, he abruptly chopped his throttle and deployed his flaps, attempting to force Welch into an overshoot. Nevertheless, the P-40 possessed superior energy management capabilities compared to the Val. Welch deftly reduced power, extended his attack run by an additional 2 seconds, and meticulously walked his devastating fire from the tail forward. The bomber's rudder disintegrated first, followed by its elevator, and finally, the relentless rounds penetrated the fuselage. The Val inverted and spiraled violently into the Pacific Ocean. 5 enemy aircraft were now accounted for. The psychological warfare inherent in the wave-hopping tactic became brutally evident at this critical juncture. Japanese bomber crews had undergone rigorous training for high-altitude formation flying and coordinated defensive maneuvers against conventional fighter attacks. Their drills specifically prepared them for scenarios where American fighters would dive from above or execute beam attacks from the flanks. Crucially, no training had ever prepared them for the unprecedented threat of a lone fighter launching attacks from below sea level. Post-war intelligence gathered by American listening posts, analyzing captured radio chatter, unveiled a state of absolute disarray within the Japanese formations. Pilots frantically inquired about the fighter's location, while rear gunners reported their inability to visually acquire the elusive threat. Formation leaders desperately attempted to maintain order amidst the chaos, even as their aircraft vanished one after another into the vast expanse of the Pacific. The 6th kill occurred when Welch expertly intercepted a straggling bomber that had fallen behind in its efforts to maintain formation. This particular Val already exhibited signs of damage, possibly sustained from the intense anti-aircraft fire encountered over Pearl Harbor. It was flying noticeably nose-high, struggling to maintain its altitude. Welch approached stealthily from directly astern at wave-top level, then ascended sharply to 60 feet, and discharged a brief, precise burst of fire. The bomber's engine seized immediately, its propeller windmilling to a complete stop. The pilot, in a desperate attempt, tried to ditch the crippled aircraft in the water, but at a speed of 180 knots, the Val impacted the ocean surface with the force of concrete, cartwheeling violently for 200 yards before succumbing to the depths. 6 Japanese aircraft were now destroyed, with 9 still remaining in the sky. Welch's gun barrels were rapidly overheating from the sustained firing. His ammunition reserves had dwindled to below 50%, and his hands were beginning to cramp from the constant tension required to maintain control of the stick at the ultra-low altitude. Yet, his mission was far from over. The sheer audacity of his innovative tactic was proving exceptionally effective. The Japanese forces were utterly incapable of coordinating a cohesive defense against a threat they could neither consistently perceive nor accurately predict. What rendered wave hopping so devastatingly effective was not solely the element of surprise. It was fundamentally rooted in the principles of physics. At sea level, the air density is approximately 0.0765 pounds per cubic foot, a significant increase compared to 0.0565 at 10,000 feet. This 26% increase in air density meant that Welch's formidable .50 caliber Browning machine guns were firing through a considerably thicker atmosphere, which paradoxically stabilized the bullet trajectory over shorter distances. The rounds experienced less gravitational drop and lateral drift in the denser air, thereby ensuring his gun convergence pattern remained tighter and more predictable within engagement ranges of 300 to 500 yards. The P-40's guns were meticulously harmonized to converge at 300 yards, a standard setting designed to achieve maximum concentration of fire at that precise distance. At higher altitudes, the thinner air and typically longer engagement ranges would cause bullets to disperse more widely as they traveled, consequently diminishing the probability of hits. However, operating at a mere 50 feet, Welch consistently engaged targets between 250 and 400 yards, placing him squarely within the optimal, sweet spot, where all 6 streams of gunfire converged into a devastating cone. Every pull of the trigger unleashed approximately 40 rounds per second into a target area, roughly the size of a kitchen table. Conversely, the Japanese Val bombers were suffering from the worst possible geometric disadvantage. Their rear-facing 7.7 mm Type 97 machine guns possessed severely limited depression angles. The gunner was physically incapable of aiming more than approximately 30 degrees below the aircraft's horizontal plane. When Welch executed his attacks from wave-top level, he was approaching at a steep 40 to 50 degree upward angle from the gunner's perspective. For the gunner to even hope of scoring a hit, they would have had to lean precariously out of the aircraft and fire almost directly downward, a feat mechanically impossible given the constraints of the gun mount. The Val's defensive armament, meticulously designed for engaging fighters attacking from above or at level flight, was rendered entirely useless. Furthermore, the aspect of target silhouette played a crucial role. When an aircraft is observed from above or at the same level, one typically perceives the narrow profile of its fuselage and wings, presenting a relatively small target. However, when Welch looked up at those Vals from his low vantage point, he was afforded a view of their entire expansive wingspan, the full, broad belly of the fuselage, and the significant surface area of the horizontal stabilizer. This dramatically increased the target aspect by approximately 200%. This principle is identical to what made belly gunners on B-17 bombers so indispensable during World War II. Aircraft are most vulnerable from below because that is where they present the largest and most exposed target. The human vision factor also exerted a significant influence. Research meticulously conducted by the Army Air Force's School of Aviation Medicine in 1943 unequivocally demonstrated that pilots, when instinctively searching for aerial threats, predominantly scan the horizon line and above. This behavioral pattern is rooted in our evolutionary instincts, which historically instruct us that danger primarily emanates from above. The Japanese rear gunners were consequently afflicted by what is termed altitude bias, consistently checking the 6 o'clock high and 3 o'clock high positions while inadvertently neglecting the critical area below, near the water. By the time their brains processed the startling realization that the threat was originating from beneath them, Welch had invariably already fired his weapons and broken away from the engagement. Welch expertly exploited another brutal reality inherent in low-altitude combat. There is absolutely no margin for error on the part of the defender. If he inflicted damage upon a bomber at an altitude of 3,000 feet, the crew would typically have precious time to assess the extent of the damage, perhaps attempt rudimentary repairs, or prepare for a controlled ditching. However, when an aircraft sustained battle damage at a mere 200 feet, pilots had, at most, perhaps 3 fleeting seconds from the moment of control lost to the inevitable impact. The 7th bomber he struck served as a perfect illustration of this unforgiving reality. He scored precise hits on the port wing, effectively severing crucial control cables. The pilot, in a desperate struggle, attempted to compensate using the rudder and ailerons, but at that precarious altitude and high speed, the aircraft simply snapped inverted and plunged directly downward. There was no altitude whatsoever for recovery. There were no second chances. The Allison engine's exceptional performance at sea level also provided Welch with a distinct advantage. While the V-1710 engine notoriously struggled at high altitudes without the benefit of a supercharger, at sea level it was capable of producing its full 1,050 horsepower. The P-40 could effortlessly maintain a speed of 340 miles per hour in level flight at low altitude, whereas the Japanese VALs, already slowed from their bombing runs and now maneuvering defensively, were likely operating at speeds of perhaps 180 to 200 knots. This significant speed advantage of approximately 100 miles per hour allowed Welch to meticulously choose his attack angles, dictate the engagement ranges, and disengage effectively before the Japanese forces could coordinate any meaningful counter-tactics. The remaining 9 bombers were not prepared to capitulate without a valiant struggle. Their formation leader, presumably a seasoned veteran with prior combat experience from campaigns in China, commenced implementing a series of sophisticated evasive tactics. Instead of rigidly maintaining altitude and predictable flight paths, the VALs initiated a sequence of erratic jinking maneuvers, shallow S-turns, brief climbs followed by rapid descents, anything to complicate Welch's gun solution and make his attacks more challenging. These tactics were proving effective. His subsequent 2 attack runs resulted in hits, but crucially, not immediate kills. Rounds stitched across a fuselage without finding critical systems. Another burst shredded a tail section, yet the resilient bomber continued its flight. Welch's ammunition situation was rapidly becoming critical. He had now expended roughly 800 rounds, equating to a significant 2/3 of his total capacity. A quick mental calculation informed him that he had perhaps only 40 seconds of trigger time remaining, and he understood that every single burst needed to count. The relentless G-forces generated by the constant maneuvering were also taking a severe toll on his body. Every aggressive turn at low altitude was subjecting him to 3 to 4 Gs, and sustained G-loading causes blood to pool in the lower extremities, thereby reducing the vital oxygen flow to the brain. Pilots typically begin to experience tunnel vision around 4 Gs, and Welch had been enduring these intense loads repeatedly for nearly 8 minutes straight. His fuel gauge now indicated only 20 minutes of flight time remaining. Wheeler Field was situated approximately 15 miles away, which meant he had, at most, 5 more minutes of active combat before he would be compelled to break off his engagement or face the perilous risk of running out of fuel over the vast expanse of the ocean. I am from your country/region, and I found the video topic incredibly compelling, particularly the detailed explanation of how Welch's unique wave-hopping tactic exploited both the physical limitations of the Japanese aircraft and the psychological vulnerabilities of their crews. The strategic brilliance and sheer audacity of attacking from below, coupled with the scientific breakdown of why it was so effective, truly brought the intensity of that aerial combat to life. The aerial engagement continued with a dramatic turn as the Japanese forces, now facing increasing pressure, resorted to desperate measures. 2 of their bombers abruptly departed from their established formation, plummeting towards the ocean surface. Their intention was to emulate Welch's tactical approach, descending to a mere wave-top altitude where they would present a significantly more challenging target for tracking. This was indeed a shrewd strategic move, yet the Val dive bomber was fundamentally unsuited for the intricate, ultra-low altitude maneuvers that the P-40 fighter could execute with agility. Welch astutely targeted the first low-flying Val, approaching it from its 4 o'clock position, a vantage point that offered the rear gunner the most restricted field of fire. However, this particular gunner displayed either extraordinary courage or exceptional skill. Defying conventional limitations, he leaned out of the canopy and discharged his weapon, even though the gun mount was at the absolute extremity of its permissible traverse. Tracers, luminous streaks of light, whizzed perilously close to Welch's canopy, their proximity so alarming that he could distinctly perceive their trajectory. A single round forcefully penetrated his left wing, leaving a substantial, fist-sized aperture approximately 3 feet from the cockpit. The P-40 sustained a momentary shudder, a testament to the impact, but remarkably maintained its structural integrity. Responding with precision, Welch unleashed a controlled, 2-second burst of fire. The Val's engine instantaneously detonated in a violent eruption of oil and metallic shrapnel, marking his 7th confirmed aerial victory. By this point, the enemy formation had completely disintegrated, its constituent aircraft scattering in disarray. Some bombers were observed ascending, others rapidly descending, a few valiantly attempting to adhere to their original flight path, while the remainder dispersed erratically in various directions. This chaotic dispersion was precisely the tactical advantage Welch sought, a landscape of isolated targets rather than a cohesive, coordinated defensive posture. His keen eyes discerned a Val attempting to regain altitude, climbing back towards 2,000 feet, likely in a desperate bid to achieve sufficient height for a parachute escape should circumstances further deteriorate. Welch executed a graceful ascent to 400 feet, the highest he had ventured since the commencement of the engagement, expertly intercepting the bomber during its climbing left turn. The Japanese pilot, acutely aware of Welch's impending approach, attempted a last-ditch defensive maneuver, a split S, involving an inverted roll followed by a sharp downward pull to reverse direction. While an effective evasive tactic at higher altitudes, executing this maneuver at a mere 1,800 feet with a heavily laden bomber was tantamount to a suicidal act. The Val inverted itself, and as the pilot attempted to pull up, the aircraft simply lacked the requisite kinetic energy to successfully complete the maneuver. It stalled, remaining inverted, then plummeted through 1,000 feet before impacting the ocean in a near-vertical dive. Welch had not even needed to expend a single round. This marked his 8th kill. After 2 or 3 paragraphs, ask us to stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. 2 additional valves executed a synchronized brake, veering towards a nascent cloud bank forming to the northeast. Welch initiated a pursuit, but his dwindling fuel reserves necessitated a critical decision. He faced a stark choice: continue the chase and risk exhausting his fuel supply, or concentrate his efforts on the remaining targets still within readily accessible range. He opted for the latter, prioritizing targets of opportunity. A valve, visibly struggling to maintain its formation, became his 9th victim. A sustained 5-second burst ignited an engine fire that the crew proved utterly incapable of extinguishing. The bomber then began a controlled, yet inexorable, spiral descent, leaving a persistent trail of smoke until it ultimately struck the water approximately 3 miles offshore. By this juncture, Welch's gun barrels were radiating a vivid red glow, a phenomenon discernible even in the bright daylight. The Browning M2 machine gun was designed to sustain approximately 150 rounds per minute of continuous fire before the risk of critical overheating became imminent, and Welch had been operating his weapons well in excess of that prescribed rate. Consequently, 2 of his 6 machine guns had already seized due to extreme heat expansion, leaving him with only 4 operational weapons and an estimated total of 200 rounds remaining. His hands, numb from the incessant vibrations of the aircraft, and his neck muscles, screaming in protest from the continuous strain of tracking targets, were nearing their limits. The fuel gauge, a stark reminder of his precarious situation, was oscillating precariously around the 15-minute mark. Welch then identified 3 valves flying in a ragged, desperate formation, making a frantic dash towards the distant horizon. They were flying lower now, perhaps at an altitude of 800 feet, their pilots relentlessly pushing their engines to their absolute limits. He could discern the exhaust trails darkening perceptibly as they advanced their throttles beyond normal cruise settings, a clear indication of their maximum exertion. These crews were acutely aware of being hunted, and their sole hope lay in reaching the safety of their carriers before the lone American fighter could systematically eliminate them. However, Welch harbored no intention of allowing them to escape. He strategically positioned himself 1,200 yards behind the trailing bomber and commenced a relentless stern chase. The P-40 possessed superior speed, but the advantage was marginal. With the valves operating at emergency power, Welch was gaining perhaps 5 miles per hour on them, which implied it would take nearly 2 minutes to close to an effective firing range, a duration he likely did not possess given his diminishing fuel. Yet, something profound had shifted within Welch's psychological framework, transcending rational calculation. He had, in the preceding 12 minutes, single-handedly annihilated 9 enemy aircraft, an accomplishment that had seemed utterly impossible when he had first sighted the formation. The remaining bombers, he resolved, would not evade him. At a range of 600 yards, he initiated fire with a prolonged burst, fully cognizant that his reduced number of functioning guns necessitated extended trigger time to achieve a comparable hit density. Tracers arced gracefully towards the trailing valve. The rear gunner, undeterred, returned fire, but his rounds consistently fell short of their mark. The 7.7 mm Type 97 machine gun possessed an effective range of approximately 500 yards, with any semblance of accuracy beyond 400 yards largely a matter of hopeful conjecture. Welch's .50 caliber weapons, in stark contrast, maintained their lethal efficacy well past 1,000 yards. Rounds began to connect with devastating effect. The valve's right stabilizer absorbed multiple impacts, and the aircraft commenced a slow, uncontrolled roll to starboard. The pilot valiantly wrestled with the controls, but hydraulic fluid was visibly gushing from severed lines. The bomber inverted itself and plummeted away, marking Welch's 10th confirmed kill. The fuel warning light abruptly flashed an ominous red. Welch now had, at most, approximately 8 minutes of flight time remaining. This was an insufficient duration to return to Haleiwa, and definitively inadequate to reach Wheeler Field. Nevertheless, the 2 remaining valves were directly ahead, a mere 500 yards distant, and slightly below him. He thrust the throttle to full military power one final time. The Allison engine roared to life, its temperature gauges climbing precariously into the red zone. Army Air Forces regulations explicitly stipulated that maximum continuous power should never exceed 5 minutes to prevent catastrophic engine damage. Welch, however, had been operating at or near maximum power for almost 15 minutes. The engine, he knew, was destined to fail. It was merely a question of when. He closed to within 300 yards of the second-to-last bomber. This valve's rear gunner, remarkably, was still fighting, still firing disciplined bursts, desperately attempting to safeguard his aircraft and crew. Welch retaliated with his own fire. His ammunition counter registered 0 on 2 more guns, leaving him with only 2 functioning .50 caliber weapons, and perhaps 50 rounds total. He fired nonetheless. The remaining guns hammered for 3 seconds before they too fell silent, utterly empty. Yet, those final rounds found their mark with devastating precision. The valve's port wing root disintegrated, and the wing violently separated from the fuselage. The bomber snap-rolled uncontrollably and plunged into an irrecoverable spin, Welch's 11th victory. Only one valve remained. A solitary bomber fleeing towards the distant horizon, with a lone P-40 in relentless pursuit. Both aircraft were operating on the very last vestiges of their fuel. Welch had no ammunition whatsoever. His engine temperature was soaring past critical limits, and his fuel gauge indicated a maximum of 5 minutes of flight time. The rational decision, by all conventional standards, would have been to disengage, turn back, and attempt to reach land before his engine inevitably quit. But Welch persisted in his pursuit. He closed to 200 yards, then 100, flying directly behind the valve in perfect formation. The rear gunner was still firing. Welch could distinctly perceive the muzzle flashes, but the gunner's angle was too steep, and the rounds passed harmlessly beneath the P-40's belly. At a mere 50 yards, Welch executed an unprecedented maneuver. He pulled alongside the valve, precisely matching its speed and altitude, flying wingtip to wingtip. The Japanese pilot, in a moment frozen in time, turned his head and looked directly at Welch across the narrow expanse separating their aircraft. What thoughts traversed that pilot's mind in that fleeting instant are forever lost to history. But what transpired next became the stuff of legend. Welch edged closer, employing the P-40's wing to deliberately disrupt the airflow over the valve's wing. This technique is known as aerodynamic interference. In close formation, the turbulent air generated by one aircraft's wing can profoundly destabilize another's flight characteristics. The valve began to rock violently from side to side, its pilot desperately struggling to maintain control. Welch steadfastly held his position, his wing a mere 20 feet from the bomber, continuously generating disruptive turbulence. The Japanese pilot attempted to break away, banking sharply to the right, but his control inputs were too aggressive, too desperate. The valve stalled, snapped inverted, and plunged irrevocably into the Pacific Ocean. Welch had just achieved his 12th kill without firing a single shot, but immediately thereafter, his engine coughed ominously. Fuel starvation. The Allison engine abruptly quit, its propeller windmilling uselessly in the air. He was 12 miles from land with a completely dead engine and an estimated 2,000 feet of altitude. The glide ratio of a P-40 was approximately 8-to-1, meaning he would require 1,500 feet of altitude to glide 1 mile. The calculations, though tight, technically worked. Welch meticulously trimmed the P-40 for its optimal glide speed, 110 miles per hour indicated, and set his course for Wheeler Field. The aircraft was enveloped in an eerie silence, broken only by the rush of wind and the futile windmilling of the propeller. There was no engine rumble, no hydraulic whine, just the unsettling quiet of a 12,000-pound glider descending towards Earth. He could discern Wheeler Field in the distance, plumes of smoke still rising from hangars damaged during the Japanese attack. The runway appeared impossibly small from 8 miles out. His right wing was trailing fuel from the bullet hole it had sustained. The control surfaces responded, albeit sluggishly, indicative of damage he had not registered during the intensity of the dogfight. Furthermore, there were at least a dozen additional holes peppered across the fuselage and tail section, stark evidence of how perilously close those rear gunners had come to permanently ending his sortie. The P-40 was holding together through sheer mechanical obstinacy, but the prospect of a safe landing was going to be exceedingly problematic. Without engine power, he had no hydraulic pressure to extend his flaps or landing gear. He would be forced to make a high-speed, wheels-up, belly landing. At 1,000 feet and 4 miles out, Welch grimly realized he had miscalculated. The assumed glide ratio had not adequately accounted for the additional drag induced by the battle damage. He was losing altitude faster than optimal, perhaps 150 feet per mile instead of the anticipated 125. Reaching Wheeler Field's runway was going to be an incredibly close call, exceptionally close. He briefly contemplated bailing out, but at 800 feet, there was simply insufficient altitude for a safe parachute deployment. He was irrevocably committed to riding the aircraft down. The descent of the aircraft was perilous. Emergency response teams stationed at Wheeler Field had already identified the distressed airplane. Their trained eyes observed the silent, lifeless propeller and the unusually steep angle of its descent, signaling a grave situation. Firefighting apparatuses were already in motion, hurtling towards the runway, their foam cannons primed and ready for deployment. As George Welch's P-40 Warhawk crossed the airfield boundary at an altitude of 400 feet, its speed registered at a blistering 130 miles per hour, a full 20 knots beyond the customary landing velocity. Moments later, at 200 feet, the aircraft soared over the runway threshold. With only 100 feet separating him from the ground, Welch expertly manipulated the control stick, pulling back to convert his excessive speed into precious lift, desperately attempting to dissipate kinetic energy before the inevitable impact. The P-40 subsequently struck the asphalt with a jarring force. The metallic belly of the fuselage shrieked against the pavement, a sound akin to ripping sheet metal, as brilliant sparks erupted 30 feet behind the aircraft. Despite the restraining force of his harness, Welch's head violently snapped forward, colliding with the gun sight. The warplane skidded an astonishing 800 feet, grinding across the concrete, shedding fragments of its aluminum skin along the destructive path. Its tumultuous journey concluded a mere 200 feet from the runway's end, its nose deeply embedded in the soil, the tail section dramatically angled skyward at a 30-degree incline. Welch, with a profound sense of relief, unstrapped himself, extracted his wearied body from the confines of the cockpit, and dropped to the ground. His legs, overwhelmed by a sudden rush of adrenaline and profound physical exhaustion, threatened to buckle beneath him. A fire truck materialized within seconds, its crew members swiftly assisting him away from the mangled wreckage, mindful of the potential for an imminent conflagration. Someone offered him a life-sustaining drink of water, while another inquired about his physical well-being. Welch, his gaze fixed on the crippled P-40, remained in a state of disoriented disbelief, still attempting to comprehend the incredible events that had just unfolded. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. 23 minutes of intense flight time had culminated in 12 confirmed aerial victories for Welch, though official historical records would later attribute only 4 to him due to the absence of corroborating witnesses for the remainder. Nevertheless, those privileged to review the gun camera footage and scrutinize the bullet-ridden Japanese aircraft knew the undeniable truth of his extraordinary achievements. The ingenious wave-hopping maneuver that Welch spontaneously devised that fateful morning became an indispensable case study, meticulously analyzed at fighter weapons schools throughout the duration of the war. Marine Corps aviators operating in the vast expanse of the Pacific theater subsequently adopted various adaptations of this tactic when engaging Japanese bombers over extended stretches of ocean. The fundamental principle of utilizing natural terrain, or, in this particular instance, the undulating surface of the ocean, as a means of concealment while initiating attacks from unexpected vectors profoundly influenced tactical doctrine for many decades to come. Contemporary fighter pilot strategies continue to incorporate terrain masking and low-altitude approach techniques, directly attributable to pivotal engagements such as Welch's. For his unparalleled actions on December 7, 1941, George Welch was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Many in the military community firmly believed he merited the Medal of Honor, but a lingering controversy surrounding whether he had received an official order to take flight ultimately resulted in the conferral of the lesser award. He gallantly survived the war, credited with 16 confirmed kills, subsequently transitioning into a distinguished career as a test pilot. Notably, he was the first American aviator to unofficially surpass the speed of sound in 1947, though Chuck Yeager later received official recognition for this groundbreaking achievement. Tragically, Welch's life ended in 1954 when an F-100 Super Sabre jet, which he was rigorously testing, disintegrated during a high-speed dive. Yet, on that pivotal Sunday morning above Pearl Harbor, Second Lieutenant George Welch unequivocally demonstrated that a potent combination of tactical brilliance and sheer, unadulterated audacity could indeed surmount seemingly insurmountable obstacles. 15 Japanese bombers had embarked from their carriers that morning, fully anticipating an unhindered return journey. 12 of those aircraft never reached their home base. A solitary American pilot, flying alone at wave-top level, guided by nothing but raw instinct and armed with 6.50 caliber machine guns, single-handedly redefined the established rules of air combat in 23 minutes of absolute, unbridled chaos. I am from your country/region, and I found the video topic about George Welch's incredible bravery and tactical innovation during the Pearl Harbor attack to be truly inspiring. It's a powerful reminder of how individual courage and quick thinking can turn the tide in the most desperate situations, and it highlights the lasting impact of such ingenuity on military strategy.